Today we have a really shocking video to share with you. It's going to be an exploration of a Christian pastor, teacher, and theologian who was never involved in any scandal. And during his life, he was a trailblazer in interdisciplinary studies, a priest, a theologian, lecturer, professor, writer, academic, and with all of those hats, always a priest. It's time to explore the remarkable job change of Henri Nouwen. Welcome, explorers, and in this video we're going to explore Henri Nouwen leaving for a fairly unexpected job for a Harvard professor to take. Well, to give you a little background on Nouwen, he was born and raised in the Netherlands in 1932, and upon completion of his seminary studies, he was ordained as a Catholic priest. But once he was an ordained priest, Nouwen's hunger to learn was not satiated. He wanted to study more. To be exact, he wanted to study the intersection of theology and psychology, but interdisciplinary studies was not really a thing in the 1950s and 60s. So Nouwen asked and received permission from his bishop to study psychology rather than theology. With seminary training behind him, he sort of began his own interdisciplinary studies. And when you read Nouwen, you can clearly see the beautiful blend of theology and psychology, spirit and mind, and whole person soul care. He focused his study on clinical pastoral education, CPE, where counseling and theology collide to help people in crises. After completing his academic studies in Europe, he moved to Kansas to further his study of CPE. Not only can you see the blend of whole person soul care in Nouwen's writings that minister to the spirit, mind, and body, you see it manifested in his life. For a white European Dutchman, he stood for the rights of all colors. He wanted more than forgiveness for others. He wanted to uplift the entire person. He marched in Selma, Alabama with Martin Luther King Jr. He led worship during anti-nuclear protest. He led retreat for Nicaragua's Sandinista leaders as well as senators and military personnel, striving for peace in Central America. He visited civil rights protesters in jail and fought for peace in a myriad of situations. All the while he was serving, his academic brilliance was undeniable, and soon he was teaching at some of the most prestigious universities in the United States. All right, right now I want you to think of the 5 best academic universities you can think of. Go ahead. Do you have them? Well, I know you named Belmont University and the University of the South as number 1 and number 2 on your list, but I am sure your 3 through 5 were institutions where Nouwen taught, or at least you would not be surprised if these schools were in a person's top 5 list. I mean, is there a more famous Catholic university in the United States other than Notre Dame? And let's all put aside our frustration in the fact that Notre Dame's football team can go 6-4 and somehow still be ranked in the top 10. That drives us all nuts. But as Catholic universities go, Notre Dame was a very prestigious teaching post for Nouwen. Well, after Notre Dame, Nouwen spent a decade as a professor at Yale University. So Nouwen left a prestigious Catholic institution for the Ivy Leagues. While at Yale, Nouwen was firmly established as an academic giant in the field of interdisciplinary theological, psychological, and divinity studies. He became a sought-after speaker. He taught, he traveled, and spoke. During his downtime from teaching and speaking, he wrote and continued his own spiritual journey with God. Many of his books are opening the doors to his own spiritual quest, broken moments and intimacy with his doubts, and intimacy with his God. The honesty of Nouwen's writings are incredible. But with this background, let's move into the main topic of this video. After a decade at Yale, Harvard began to come calling. I imagine many, if not most of you, would put Harvard as a top 5 academic school in the United States. Harvard is without question the pinnacle of academia. There are some academic institutions that are at Harvard's level, but if you are a professor at Harvard, you are at the top of the academic mountain. There may be some scholars that are on your level, but you are not looking up to anyone. You, again, are at the top. Well, Harvard came calling to Nouwen, and Nouwen showed some interest, but he also wanted to pursue other ventures besides teaching. He wanted to write, explore his own faith, lead retreats, and just pursue other ideas. So Nouwen requested that if it does come to teach at Harvard, he would like to only teach half-time. Nouwen requested of Harvard that he only teach 6 months, and then he has a 6-month sabbatical every year to pursue other activities. Let that idea marinate in your brain. Nouwen requested of Harvard that he only teach half a year, and then he is on a yearly 6-month sabbatical for the other half. That is an incredible request of a university that most professors would cut off their left leg to join. But Nouwen, as we will see, is not driven by prestige. He is not driven by becoming an elite, snooty Harvard professor. He is not driven by fame or by how many people want him to speak. He is driven by being faithful to the vocation and calling that God has for him. Nouwen believed that God wanted him writing books, spending time at monasteries to pray, and growing personally, to lead retreats, to speak, to minister in other ways than just teaching. Well, to give you a proper idea of Nouwen's status as an academic giant pioneering psychological theological studies, Harvard said, "Sure, whatever you want. We will be glad to give you 6 months of yearly vacation." I can't even fathom being that good at my job. I get worried every time someone preaches in my church besides me that my church is going to realize that there are much better preachers out there than me. Nouwen was such an amazing academic and professor and person that Harvard said, "We will give you 6 months of a yearly vacation if you will join us." Can you even imagine? So there is Nouwen sitting on top of the academic heap as a divinity professor at Harvard with a 6-month sabbatical every year. Find a professor, any professor, and ask them how awesome it would be to teach at one of the most prestigious universities with a 6-month sabbatical every year, and then quickly hand them a handkerchief to wipe the envious drool spilling down their chin. Well, in 1983, interestingly, the same year he was appointed to teach at Harvard, Nouwen was spending a few months in the L'Arche community in Trosly, France. L'Arche is an organization with facilities in multiple countries around the world that ministers to the mentally disabled. Nouwen was friends with Jean Vanier, the founder of L'Arche. French. That's a new language for me to butcher on this channel. Well, while visiting L'Arche in France, Nouwen saw a poster on an office door of the painting of the Return of the Prodigal Son by Rembrandt. What Nouwen calls a seemingly insignificant encounter with a poster turns out to be anything but insignificant. Now, not to bog you down with the details, if you want more details, read Nouwen's book, The Return of the Prodigal Son, where he walks you through the details of this journey, which even includes a trip to Russia to see the original painting. But meditating on this painting of the Return of the Prodigal Son, Nouwen began to wonder, where is his home? Where does he belong? You see, the painting of the Return of the Prodigal Son is a painting of Luke chapter 15, where a lost son who wastes his inheritance returns home. And he is welcomed home lovingly by his father. The painting shows the son being embraced by his father in a welcome home gesture, and a gesture that says, "This is where you belong." Well, Nouwen began to meditate on that idea. Where does God want me? Where do I belong in God? What should I be doing? These are remarkable questions being wrestled with by a man who every professor in the world would say had the greatest job ever. 6-month professor at a prestigious university and 6 months off as a sabbatical every year. Well, while working through his vocational calling, Nouwen visited multiple L'Arche communities during his time as a Harvard professor. He returned to France and visited a community just outside of Toronto in Richmond Hill, Canada. And in 1986, Henri Nouwen left the academic elite for the academically disabled, and he became the priest for the L'Arche community in Richmond Hill. Nouwen spent the last decade of his life there at L'Arche as a priest for the mentally disabled. And in his writings, Nouwen speaks of the mentally disabled's ability to minister to him in amazing ways. They gave him a sense of belonging and acceptance that he longed for. and he got to minister to them as well. He took all of his academic prowess in theology and psychology out of the ivory tower and he poured it into real lives. And the residences of Loyarch took all of their academic poverty and poured into Nouwen. And together they were just what one another needed. I think the story of Nouwen leaving Harvard to become a priest to a mentally disabled community shows us that there are some Christians out there who desire to just do what God calls them to do. God wanted Nouwen to speak for black rights. He did. God wanted Nouwen to speak for peace in Latin American countries. He did. God wanted him to bring psychology and theology together to minister to mind and spirit. He did. God wanted him to teach. He did. God wanted him to be a priest to the mentally disabled. He did. Nouwen was just a man who said yes to God. Now go read Life of the Beloved, The Return of the Prodigal Son, A Cry for Mercy, Clowning in Rome, Wounded Healer. Go read some Henri Nouwen. And as always, my bibliography is in the description below. Be blessed.